Welcome to SASE's featured panel. Today, I feel energized to be part of today's discussion on transformative innovation and grand challenges. We're happy to bring together scholars from South Africa, Singapore, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Montreal, Canada, and London in England. To start, SASE wants to thank this year's virtual conference organizers. We also would like to thank the KHK Center for Global Cooperation in collaboration with the IAQ and the DIFIS. You can find about these academic institutions by clicking on their logos in the homepage of the SASE conference. I would like to start by introducing our panelists for today's discussion. First, let me start with introducing Erika Kraemer-Mbula, Professor of Economics at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, where she is the DST NRF Newton Fund Trilateral Chair in Transformative Innovation, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and Sustainable Development. Erika has been a pioneer in developing alternative frameworks for thinking about development paths for African economies, particularly thinking about the interactions between innovation systems and equitable development and inclusive development, particularly focusing her pioneering work on innovation in African economies. As is also important to note is that Erika, as a scholar, has also been very engaged with policy work in Africa, and she has been actively contributing to how to develop science, technology, and innovation infrastructure. And for example, she has been part of the advisory committee of the Center for Science, Technology, and Innovation, and she is part of various reference groups at the National Advisory Council on Innovation. So we have a scholar who is also very engaged in South Africa and with African economies in general. Our next panelist, Henry Yeung, distinguished professor at the Department of Geography and Global Production Network Center at the National University of Singapore. Henry's work has been important in developing our views and understanding of global production networks and the global economy. And he has been influential in thinking about theories about the geography of transnational corporations, about East Asian firms, and also the developmental states in Asia. His books include recently, for example, the Strategic Coupling, East Asian Industrial Transformation in the New Global Economy. Another book is on global production networks, theorizing economic development in an interconnected world. And his most recent work is on interconnected worlds, global electronics and production networks in East Asia. And our third panelist, is Joanna Chattaway, and I'm introducing them in the order that they will be presenting. Joanna is professor and head of the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy at the University College London. She has been a leader in the field of science and innovation policy and spearheading the ideas of integrating research on science, science policy, and innovation policy. She has been also pushing the boundaries at the intersection of the co-production of policy, public and private sector engagement, and she has also been a leader in thinking about health innovation, which I think, and equity and innovation, both in the advanced economies as well as in lower income and middle income countries, particularly in the African context. So here, for our discussion on reframing innovation and science policy, and for thinking about technology innovation and challenges in health, Joanna has been a leading contributor. Our fourth panelist, Rebecca Henderson. She is university professor at Harvard University and professor at the Harvard Business School. She is a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a fellow of both the British Academy and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Rebecca is an expert on innovation and organizational change, and particularly her work has developed our ideas on how the private sector is playing a role in building a more sustainable economy, particularly looking at the intersections between the organizational purpose, innovation, and high-performance organizations. Her recent publications include Leading Sustainable Change, an Organizational Perspective, and another book called Accelerating Energy Innovations, Lessons from Multiple Sectors, addressing the issues at the intersection of sustainability and innovation. So I'm delighted to welcome our four panelists. And let me, before I go here, to just say briefly that the discussion on grand challenges and innovation are often brought together. One, because grand challenges, of course, involves the notion that there are significant problems affecting society that have a lot of complexity and that require novel ideas and unconventional approaches to address the complexity and to advance possibilities. Issues of inequalities, which have been high on the discussion with the pandemic, but that permeate our society in terms of race, gender, ethnicity, class, disabilities. All of these social inequalities are very much at the heart of discussions on grand challenges. The issues of technologies, how they're designed. If we look at healthcare, how are they designed? How are they implemented? How do they work in our societies? And how are they mobilized? And of course, another one that has been very much at the top of the agenda is the challenge of climate change, the urgent ecological crisis of global warming and pollution, and how to rethink our relationships between organizations and the environment, between humans and nature. As important, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals that set the agenda for poverty alleviation and for transformative steps needed to shift to more sustainable paths. So all of these grand challenges, of course, are always connected to discussions on innovation. And then the idea is, how do we push our thinking about innovation, the way we conceptualize? And our four panelists today have been at the forefront for thinking about how we move our conceptualization. So let's get into it, and we'll start with Erika.
Thanks so much for the introduction. I will start by sharing my slides, so I get that out of the way. I hope you can see them well. Okay.
Yes, you can put them on full mode, full screen mode, and slideshow.
Yes. Okay. I hope I hope you can see them well. Yes. Okay. So good day, everyone, and thanks so much for the great introduction and to the organizers for inviting me to this very important panel. This is a very important topic, and thanks also to everyone who has joined this session. And I really look forward to a fruitful discussion. So, as mentioned in my introduction, I'm based at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, and I'll make some general remarks about transformative innovation and grand challenges, but I will try to reflect on the context where I live and where I work in, which is South Africa and Africa more broadly. So really, it's very clear at this point in time that we are at a crossroads, although the meaning of what development is itself is complex and contested and elusive. It's usually linked to an improvement of people's lives, to societal well-being, and what indicators or measurements we use for that is another big question. But I wanted to start by highlighting that we're clearly engaged in unsustainable modalities of development. And this graph here illustrates the ecological footprint of countries with different levels of human development. You may be familiar with it. So what this graph is telling us is that we have been unable to marry our objective of improving people's well-being with living within the environmental limits. So countries that have managed to reach high and very high levels of human development have done so at the expense of excessively sort of surpassing in a way their share of biocapacity. So science, technology, and innovation have been main drivers for this explosive development in some countries that we see on the right of this graph, and have increased life expectancy, expanded the access to education and the well-being of the population. But paradoxically, the types of science, technology, and innovation driving such development have also brought some negative environmental and societal impacts, or have not managed to mitigate them sufficiently. So I want to bring my comments to this segment of the figure, which represents the large number of African countries which are marked in yellow, that are still operating within the Earth's biocapacity limits, but they are far from reaching high levels of human development. So I'll reflect on what does transformative innovation mean in such context? What kinds of innovation do we need to think about to move horizontally along this graph? Disruptive changes are clearly needed also in those countries that have reached high levels of development, but I'll not discuss those in these short remarks here. So Africa's aspirations for transformation are largely captured by a number of Pan-African strategies, and I will not go into detail in this, but we have Agenda 2063, Africa We Want, which tries to outline the way in which the continent should look by 2063, based on several pillars. We have the African Development Bank's high 5 priorities of light up Africa, feed Africa, integrate Africa, industrialize, improve the quality of life, and so on. And overarching all that, we have obviously the SDGs, which balance the dimensions of economic, social, and environmental development. And all of that is underpinned by our understanding that science, technology, and innovation play a key role in driving the accomplishments of the aspirations in these agendas. And there's also quite a high level of alignment between these 3 agendas, and an understanding that the future of Africa transcends the continent itself, and that the challenges experienced by Africans are shared by humanity. So there's a correlation or a close alignment between these Pan-African strategies that I mentioned now. So what is transformative innovation in the context of Africa? Transformative innovation must result in the improvement of the lives of the majority. We see these continental aspirations in the continent, seeing transformation primarily as endogenous. So building on existing assets, work with what you have, and guided by these principles of the inclusive development. So giving voice to and power to excluded groups, and also redistributing in a way the incomes generated by both the formal and informal sectors, and facilitating interactions with other stakeholder groups. And also it's clear that transformation for sustainable development must expand beyond the national boundaries and focus on those planetary boundaries and driven by the SDGs. So in this light, I would like to make 2 suggestions in my last couple of minutes of key areas that, from my point of view, deserve attention when we think about the transformative potential of different types of innovation. So I would like to draw attention to the informal economy. The informal economy is often overlooked as a factor driving structural change in the continent. But however, informal economy is on the rise in all African countries, along with economic growth, and even more in the context of COVID-19 and the impact that it's had in economic activity and driving a lot of actors into informality. It contributes to about 2/3 of the non-agricultural employment, about 1/3 of the continent's GDP, generates most of the new jobs in Africa, and is conventionally seen as rudimentary and survivalist. But recent studies are showing us that this innovative behavior by informal entrepreneurs who trying to solve day-to-day challenges often come up with new ways of doing things, new ways of creating businesses, and often changing the way things are done more broadly and having transformative impacts in the communities and beyond. So I want to give the example, for instance, of informal waste collectors and how they contribute to the informal the circular economy. In the city where I live, in Johannesburg, thousands of informal waste collectors live from recycling, and they divert tons of recyclable waste, and often they are overlooked as a source of economic activity. But they are tightly connected to a formal chain of recycling that is important to consider. So they are part and parcel of a broader economic system that involves both formal and informal, or actors with different degrees of formality operating, collaborating, and engaging. And when you look at it in detail, you can extract very multiple positive contributions of informal waste recycling that connect to specific SDGs. I'll move quickly because I understand that I'm eating into somebody else's time. But very quickly, I want to also highlight the transformative potential of digitalization. Africa has moved into, has gone through a process of rapid digitalization. Some scholars refer to it as leapfrogging, with exploring internet capacity. Is a source of dynamism of entrepreneurship. Is bringing new opportunities into finance and agricultural applications and access to education. However, it's got a downside to it, which is the persistent digital divide, the limitations in terms of infrastructure, and that is in a way changing the employment relationships, sometimes leading to more precarious conditions of employment, and also the limited regulation. But nevertheless, it's creating, it's got a huge potential for widespread change that is still to be exploited in the continent. So in view of these two potential avenues for transformative change in the continent based on innovation, I would like to finalize by reflecting on them, by indicating that it's important to support innovations that have this fast adoption and diffusion, that have more equitable access and generate employment and larger social returns. So often looking at constrained environments where the majority is can be an important starting point to look at transformative innovation for sustainable solution. And finally, it's important to leverage the transformative power of digital technologies and to use it to address those underlying societal imbalances and exclusions that exist in the continent, rather than as an avenue for broader concentration and inequality. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Erika. It's our turn, Henry.
Okay, I shall share my screen. Okay. So first of all, let me thank Paola and the conference organizing committee for inviting me to share my thoughts with our distinguished panelists and participants. I follow Erika's presentation, the last bit on digitalization, I think quite well, since I've been working on the, if you like, the electronics and semiconductor industry lately. Just finished my book's finalization, so I thought I'd bring something out from the book with specific regard to the idea of competition in technology and the call for, if you like, deglobalization or decoupling. So what I'm trying to do is really to talk about these two challenges. One is the technological leadership that we see in the world economy. That's why I started with this 3 nano, which is about chip making semiconductors by next year at 3 nanometer process node. And of course, some of you might have heard of the current global chip shortages that spill over to the automotive and other industries. So I think this is one of the major post-pandemic challenges that it has all kinds of non-economic implications as well. Second is to do with the challenge of too much dependency, and again, coming from East Asia, too much manufacturing dependency on China. as well as East Asia, as some would like to argue. And of course, the argument for decoupling or moving away from excessive concentration of such activities in China or East Asia, in what is generally known as the so-called reshoring initiatives, whether in Europe, in North America, or the USA in particular, as well as, of course, lately also, I think Australia, Japan are seeking such activities, reshoring of manufacturing. But of course, there is a question of to where within the, if you like, the domestic economy. So I'm going to talk about two sort of public policies in this, what I would like to call interconnected worlds, which I think some questions need to be raised. First is to do with, how to resolve this grand challenge of, if you like, making the world less highly concentrated in terms of productive activities in specific countries and or locations. Of course, there is the current initiatives in relation to what some others would like to call techno-nationalism, or the idea of defensive protectionist policies, of course, quoted in the name of industrial policy, which to some, of course, some of our panelists are economists as well, can be a dirty word. Industrial policy means some kind of market interventions. Recently, of course, those in the US will know you have a new budget approved, $52 billion of the Chips for America Act essentially is trying to attract semiconductor manufacturing back in the US. And I would like to argue that wouldn't really save lead firms like Intel, of course, the Intel that many of us know of, that goes into your computer and so on, nor the opposite. China has been trying to pump $150 billion into what is called Made in China in the semiconductor fund for 10 years, 2015 to 2025. Again, that wouldn't seem to be able to save China's leading semiconductor manufacturer known as SMIC, because as some of you might know, the US has imposed sanction on American technology exports to SMIC. The real crux of the matter is that if you look at the number I give you, even Taiwan's leading manufacturers, TSMC, or South Korea's two largest semiconductor manufacturer, Samsung and Hynix, they are each investing a minimum of 100 to 150 billion in the next 3 to 5 years in semiconductor manufacturing and technological innovation and development. So, as you can tell, even national efforts of the US, China, may seem pale in comparison to what individual firms may invest in. So that's the first point I want to make. In other words, industrial policy cannot be seen as the, if you like, the savior that saved the kind of a decline in certain kind of a technological and innovation capacity. Second is that, of course, again, there are discussions of things need to be made in specific locations, right? I'm a geographer, so I'm very interested in where things are made. So there are lots of this kind of initiatives ranging from developing countries, the kind of China made in China, India made in India. Of course, the US has its own initiative made in America to sort of reshore manufacturing activities as a way to reduce, if you like, the evils of globalization. Yeah, and I would like to argue, I think in terms of studying East Asian developmental states for an extended period of time, there are inherent limits to state capacity, what the state can actually do despite policy proclamations. There are also very often perverse policy outcomes ranging from this kind of defensive interventions. Some of you may know Foxconn from Taiwan used to promise Trump that it will invest up to something like $10 to $12 billion in Wisconsin over that period of time. And as of 1 or 2 months ago, it's confirmed that it will scale down to just a few $100 million investment. So again, many of this kind of, if you like, reshoring, industrial renaissance need to be thought through very carefully rather than rushed through, of course, due to political exigencies. My final slide is just to say that industrial development, which is a very important issue throughout the world, how to capture greater value from industrialization in the world of interconnections, production networks, value chains. There are a few issues. I think one is to say nationalization of the entire production line doesn't seem to work. It's very hard to think of a national industry meaning from the head to the tail of the entire value chain, you want everything to be captured in one country. That's very difficult. And you also wouldn't solve immediate issues such as the chip shortages, for example. So you can't nationalize semiconductors and say, okay, then I can save the car makers, so to speak. Second is that I think everybody acknowledge that there is need to reduce dependency on China. I think that is a fair point, and is well made. China's share as a global factory has gone too far. But even China +1 or China +2, or as I will put it, China +N reconfigurations will mean that there are new opportunities for other, particularly developing countries, to benefit from, if you like, the outward movement of manufacturing activities from China, which might actually be owned by foreign firms, not necessarily by Chinese firms. But on the other hand, recent data have shown that Chinese investment in Southeast Asia has gone up in terms of manufacturing activities. But more importantly, for developing countries, as well as even for developed countries, to take a greater part in this reshoring, or if you like, relocation of manufacturing activities, is important to take into account of the capability building at firm means a company level, as well as ecosystem development that does not exclude, if you like, foreign entities. So you need to build good local ecosystems in order to attract greater manufacturing activities, which in turn create opportunities for access to technology and global markets. And that is the kind of a global production networks work that I've been doing, and hopefully I can share more with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. We'll go now to Joanna.
Yes, hi. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm really pleased to be with you for this discussion. I wanted to talk today about some findings from a project that I'm involved with at the moment. The project is the STRINGS project, Steering Research Innovation for the Global Goals. It's a project which is funded by the UK Research and Innovation Agency and conducted with UNDP. And as part of this project, we've endeavoured to do a global mapping of scientific outputs. We've looked at publications and patents, but I'm going to focus on publications today. I'm just wondering, can you see my slides here? Great, good. Okay, yes. So I thought it would be interesting in the context of this discussion to talk about this aspect of the work we're doing in this project, trying to map science and research to the global goals. It's not the only work we're doing under the project, but perhaps of interest and relevance to today's discussion. In doing this, I also just want to say, I know that innovation is much broader than science and research, and that's really important to keep in mind, but also important to keep in mind that huge amounts of money get spent on science research and R&D every year. And of course, there are certain fields of innovation where research and science is very important. So, the data we're collecting allows us to do things like this. It allows us to look at where the big issues in terms of meeting SDG targets are in any one country, and then where spending on research and innovation is going, prioritization of research research and science is going, not so much innovation, because these are publications. And we're using publications as a proxy for prioritization. So you can see, for example, in the UK, there's a need, if we're looking at SDG targets, for us to focus on responsible consumption in the UK. That is not where, not a research priority in the UK. Actually, you can look at Argentina and see the same. In Tanzania, for example, lots of work to be done in meeting SDG targets in relation to industry, infrastructure, and innovation, but not a significant priority in terms of the research that is being done. So I'm the last two presenters have actually said very interesting things about and very different things about the capacity of national policy making to address big transformative global goals. And I'm not suggesting by presenting these maps that there's an easy fix in realigning science to be more aligned with SDGs, but interesting, I think, for us to have an awareness of the picture in different countries. I don't know what I've done, but I can't seem to move the slides forward. Try this. Okay, there we go. So if we look at a broader picture, not at the national level, but at the data overall, this is what it's telling us. The big finding for me actually is this note on the right-hand side of the screen that 90% of SDG related research is done in high income and upper middle income countries. So I was expecting that figure to be high, but I was shocked at the 90% figure. That is quite overwhelming. And it begs the question, I think, you know, in relation to the SDGs and in relation to big global goals, social, economic, environmental goals, is it really possible for us to meaningfully think about addressing those goals if that is the picture of where research and science efforts are being undertaken? I think it does raise some real questions. Most research is unrelated to the SDGs. I'm aware that there will be a lot of questions about how we've defined SDG related research, and I'll say a little bit more about that in the next slide. But important to note, I think, that in low income countries, the percentage of non-SDG related research is much lower. You'll see health being very well catered for here on the surface anyway, in terms of research in relation to the SDGs, but that does include cancer. So within that category, there may well be a skewed prioritization which won't serve all countries' nations' needs. So summary of some of the main findings, you can see low income countries seem to be relatively specialized in SDG relevant research. In terms of relative misalignments and alignments in SDGs, there seems to be a positive relationship and alignment in SDG 2, in SDG 3 and 6, so that countries that have major challenges in those SDGs are relatively specialized in research that's relevant. There's a misalignment that we can detect quite clearly in education and affordable and clean energy, responsible consumption and production, and climate action. So countries that have major challenges in those SDGs are not relatively specialized in research related to those SDGs. And as I mentioned, most research is being done in high and upper middle income countries where SDG challenges are one could argue smaller, and more than 50% of research in the web of science is unrelated to issues that are relevant to the SDGs. So as I said, I'm aware that there will be lots of questions about you know, how we've done this analysis, what it means in terms of the criteria we've used, relevant and non-relevant SDG research. So we're going to put up a dashboard on the project website, and hopefully that will allow people certainly to examine the criteria that we've used, but we're hoping to make it interactive so that people can go in and use the criteria that they deem to be relevant. So that's what I wanted to present today, and I'll just leave you. We do have a Delphi survey as part of the project, which is still open. So if any of you are interested in participating in the project and helping us to figure out broader aspects of alignment and misalignment of STI in relation to the SDGs, please do give it a go. That's me.
Thank you, Joanna. And before I turn to our fourth final panelist, I would like to tell our participants that you can use the chat feature to send questions. And of course, after later on, you can also raise your hand, but a lot of good ideas being generated through our presentation. So I would like you to know that you have that feature to use. All right, so we'll go now to Rebecca. Your turn.
Paola, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. And my thanks to my fellow panelists who have laid out some extraordinarily interesting ideas. The title of the panel is Grand Challenges and Transformative Innovation. And as my fellow panelists have pointed out, there's both huge opportunity and huge need in really innovating if we're to solve the enormous challenges that we face. I spent the early part of my career looking at innovation and innovation sessions. And Joanna, I'm absolutely fascinated by your analysis and the fact that so little relative innovation is going in, for example, into clean energy and climate action. And Henry, you are right on top of one of the most hot button issues in the world right now, which is how do we think of building co-specialized ecosystems that build prosperity for the entire world and don't fall afoul of these increasingly nationalist and populist boundaries that we're seeing. And Erika, you're tackling like innovation in Africa, which is arguably the most important focus for our research. How do we make sure that as the African populations grow, we see real human development in Africa, but without further stressing our planetary boundaries? So I want to double down on the importance of innovation policy, good old-fashioned innovation as solutions to the challenges of inequality and exclusion, climate change, and environmental degradation. But my own research in the last few years has been focused on institutional reform. Some years ago, I became fascinated by the question of why we did not have sensible global carbon regulation. You know, sometimes it's easy to think of this as a price for carbon. At the moment, in many places, you can burn fossil fuels, imposing enormous damage, both on public health right now and on future generations, without paying any price for doing so. And as an economist and a card-carrying member of the Guild, I'm persuaded that if we could adopt sensible climate regulation, some kind of price for burning fossil fuels, perhaps cap and trade, we could talk about the details. It would make an enormous difference and generate huge amounts of innovation, but it's not happening nearly fast enough. So I became very interested in the intersection between the private sector and institutions. As the development economists have long told us, healthy societies are characterized by so-called inclusive institutions, a well-functioning competitive market, a democratically accountable, transparent, capable government, and a strong civil society. And of course, I'm summarizing years of research, much of which will be familiar to my fellow panelists and people listening to the panel. But this fundamental idea that the free market needs to be in balance with a strong, democratically accountable state and a civil society that can both balance the power of business and the power of government is not per se a controversial idea. The difficulty is building such institutional regimes, and in the last few years, we've seen those come under enormous stress in several countries, including here in the United States. So Henry, you know, your slides are saying incredibly sensible things about industrial policy, but incredibly sensible conversations about policy is not really what's driving politics in the United States right now. As I'm sure you know, it's a very disconcerting moment to be an American. So I think one small contribution to transformative innovation is persuading the private sector that they have a strong interest in strong government and strong civil society, that addressing the problems we face, driving innovation at scale, will require the private sector to participate, absolutely, but it will also require sensible regulation and reasonable funding. And so it's easy to say, but hard to do. This notion of public-private partnership is absolutely critical. And of course, that's critical on the local level, but it's also critical on national and global levels. So over the last 10 years, I've been very engaged in a project that I call Reimagining Capitalism. Developing a course in the area, writing cases. I recently published a book in the area, really underlining what many of my colleagues in the private sector are saying, which is we need to innovate in how we think about the role of the firm. That for many managers, the goal of the firm has been to maximize profits, put your head down, make payroll, and that's hard enough, but that we need to reconceptualize the role of the firm as being broader than that, to think about the firm's goal as being, in the words of my colleague Colin Meyer at Oxford, to solve public problems profitably and to refrain from creating further problems. And so the role of the firm should be, yes, to make money and run a flourishing enterprise and generate jobs, but also to be an active partner in addressing these kinds of public problems. And both I and many of my colleagues have shown that there is lots of money to be made in this approach. My colleague Michael Porter calls this creating shared value, making both public and private value at the same time. And we see this in firms like Enel or Iberdrola in Europe that moved much earlier than any of the other major electric utilities in Europe to embrace renewables. And in doing so helped accelerate innovation in renewable energy, reposition Europe to move away from fossil fuels, and make themselves really quite profitable and successful. For Enel, for example, their renewable plants are now more profitable than their old style fossil fuel plants. So working with the private sector to accelerate innovation in these important technologies and opportunities, which can help transform the economy. But also working with the private sector to persuade them that it's in their interest to insist for the kinds of policies that my colleagues on the panels have advocated for. So we see firms moving together in coalition to say, no, we must stop deforestation. Working with the Brazilian government prior to the recent change in political regime in Brazil to build a real partnership between the firms that buy timber and soy and beef and the Brazilian government to say, no, it's not in any of our interests to cut down the Amazon. We will only buy sustainably grown timber or beef. You must make sure that you enforce the local laws. So an active partnership with government in designing appropriate regulation and in enforcing those regulations. And last but not least, I believe that the private sector has a strong interest in supporting real democracy and strong government. And so, for example, as we see here in the US, firms beginning to stand up and saying, no, the right to vote is fundamental to a strong economy. I like to say that free markets need free politics, that we will only solve the problems we face with both the power of the free market and the power of a well-run, democratically accountable state and a strong civil society, together creating the policies and investments that will drive the massive innovation we need to address the global challenges we face.
Thank you, Rebecca. Perfect timing for all of our panelists. Thank you for the generative ideas. So we'll turn to the discussion. So here's what we're going to do. I'll kick off with the first questions. And I see that in the chat, we already have some questions for our audience, our attendees. Let me tell you that you can use the chat feature, or you can also use the raise hand feature to ask questions to the panelists. And I'll start with a couple of questions, but we can also move quickly to the audience since I want us to make sure that we have time. So very important points that you've all made. And I would like to start the discussion by bringing the different ideas that many ideas that you've raised on issues of endogenous innovation, inclusion, technological leadership, science research, the divide that you mentioned. You mentioned the digital divide, but we can talk, given the presentations by the others, geographically, we see this divide where research is being done, the rethinking of the role of the firm, and science research. So I would like us to think about the pandemic. Our presidential address raised the issue of vaccines with the COVID-19 pandemic, and it made evident many of the issues that you're raising today. Particularly, one of them was the inequalities in access to new technology, as well as the differences in capabilities to produce, as well as to come up with these new vaccines. And we've heard the response, talks of donating, of course, important as an immediate response. We've heard about sharing of intellectual property. But, we've seen situations where if we look at the latest technology, let's say that has been the most effective at dealing with, in terms of vaccines, it's highly concentrated. Going back to your points on science research and what Henry was bringing up, we did not see South Africa, for example, coming up there. Brazil, that has had, let's say, in the past, the capability to produce vaccines with the traditional or old technologies, did not come up with that. And we've seen India producing vaccines with old technology. So my question to you is, as we think about this, it really shows a divide, and it shows the challenges of this notion of how do we push endogenous innovation, and what do we think about the role of the source. So what could you comment here in terms of how this makes you think about innovation? How do we push in our thinking about innovation if we take this common recent experience right now that makes evidence a lot of these points that you were raising?
How would you like us to start? Would you like us to come in at any order?
We can go in the reverse order. Whoever would like to start, we can go in the reverse order. Whoever is ready to go in the reverse order. Rebecca, if you'd like to start. Joanna, yes, Rebecca?
Sure, I'll kick off while thinking that Henry is really the guy in this area. Henry, Erika, and Joanna know more about this than I do, but I think it's a mistake to think we should have innovation capacity in every scientific area in every nation. That doesn't seem to make any sense. I mean, the kind of leading edge scientific knowledge you need to be making 2 nanometer semiconductor chips or really at the leading edge of biotech is scarce and expensive. And I think from the point of view of planetary well-being, you'd want to concentrate that expertise. We have lots of evidence to suggest you want those scientists and firms close together and learning from each other and in groups. The issue is if you have that expertise monopolized and restrained, monopolized in such a way that those who need it can't get access to it. So, we can read the concern about China as a political concern, but you could also say it's dangerous to be dependent on any single supplier because they can hold you up. And if, in this case, the Americans are right at the leading edge of the vaccine expertise, that's concerning, right? Because maybe they'll share it with everyone else and lower its price, and maybe they won't. And of course, I hope they will. But as an economist, I'm always nervous when you're dependent. So we might think perhaps about how do we support a global strategy where there are very strong centers for research in the global South, and Erika and Joanna have thought a lot about this. But maybe it's in South Africa or Nigeria where you really invest in education and support. And now I'm really thinking, because then you'd need a national strategy or a continental strategy, and I'm not sure how you do that. But Joanna, clearly you're thinking in terms of some kind of global strategy for research. So I'd love to hear more about how we might think about implementing something like
that. Thank you, Rebecca. Joanna?
Yeah, gosh, it's such an important question that you've raised, Paola, and I agree with much of what Rebecca said. I think in theory and in practice, it's very difficult to imagine that every country could be specialized in every subject area of research and science. But my goodness, during the COVID pandemic, we really have seen, in no uncertain terms, the ways in which having very low levels of capacity, manufacturing capacity, and scientific capacity have a direct kind of impact on what you are able to do to protect your citizens. And so I think this issue of how we balance the scarcity of science expertise with the need that different countries have, different governments have in relation to wanting to protect their citizens is a huge issue. I think there's definite scope for bringing together development agendas with research agendas in novel ways. There have been some noble efforts with regards to trying to do that, but there could be much more done at national and international levels to think about that. Commitments to sharing know-how as well as IP, very important in this area. Having enough capacity to be able to, absorb that absorbative capacity issue is very important too. But I think it really will require new strategies for thinking about aligning national priorities and national goals with the way that money is spent on science and research internationally, and what different regional bodies can do to facilitate greater equity in that alignment is really important. But Erika, I'm sure you'll have lots to say about this too.
Thank you, Joanna. Henry?
I really don't have much expertise on vaccine technology and R&D, and my sense is that, I mean, if you think of the most advanced vaccine technology, then it is the, I have my Pfizer jabs as well. So my son just had his yesterday. And, but then of course, there are others who don't believe in the new technology and they want to use back the proven old technology. So in a way, one might argue the jury is still out on the long-term effects, but by and large, it's fair to say we have new way of doing vaccines. So, I mean, if you ask me, if we turn back the clock, can things be done better? I would say perhaps a greater international collaboration will be one way. Second is perhaps the kind of cross-national licensing in a way that is not so profit-driven. I know I'm being idealistic here. I think the important thing is to I won't say to eliminate, but at least to reduce vaccine nationalism is perhaps is to really cross-license in a way and at a rate that is much more amenable to local production in particularly developing countries. I know Malaysia is trying to manufacture vaccines if you get licensed, and so on and so forth. So that's really my little cent worth. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Erika.
Thanks. A lot has been said already, but just from the point of view of, for instance, South Africa or the African continent, South Africa is one of the handful few countries in Africa that has sort of the capacity or the capabilities, that I said, to produce a vaccine. But unfortunately, global market dynamics, simpler processes elsewhere, cheaper imports had resulted over time in a hollowing out of sort of the local domestic capabilities to manufacture vaccines. And also there's a parallel process of concentration of research and development investments in a fewer areas because of lack of funds. You have to sort of prioritize where are the limited funds going to be put in. So I think there's a combination of factors that has led to deterioration somehow, or a hollowing out of technological capabilities in that field. And I think that speaks to the importance of how expensive it is and how important it is at the same time to keep a certain level of domestic capabilities in priority sectors. And I think the current pandemic has really woken all of us to the fact that there are certain issues that are going to repeat over time in the future. Health shocks are going to be part of our reality, and countries, especially in Africa and South Africa in particular, are really starting to realize that we have capabilities, we need to maintain them. It's important to prioritize this and leverage, as Henry is saying, on international collaboration in that process of rebuilding and reviving an existing set of domestic capabilities here. So yes, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Erika, and thank you to our panelists. I'm going to stop my second question too, because I see questions here from the audience and we want to make sure we get to them. So let me start here with some that have come in through the chat. Feel free also to use the raise hand. So here is a question to Joanna and Erika. Would the everyday innovation that Erika spoke about not systematically underrepresented in the databases that were analyzed by Joanna? So the idea of this, your everyday innovation, would that show up in Joanna's database? So Erika and Joanna.
Shall I start? Okay, the short answer is yes, and because there's so much that isn't captured but in publication data, and we know that. The slightly longer answer is if we begin to break down those more macro maps of science and research, we see actually now we see, just looking at the data that I presented, that there's that huge imbalance between research, where research is done. So over 90% in high income and upper middle income countries. And you could make the argument that even the kind of everyday innovation in the end benefits from scientific and research capabilities developing in low income contexts as well. And that's because the outputs, the benefits of investing in science aren't only the publications, those are not at all the end game. In fact, it's the skills that are embodied in and embedded in people and institutions in the country, which are relevant to everyday innovation, which are important. I think also if you begin to look at the breakdown between lab-based science and social science, for example, that's another important one. And rectifying in favor of social science, because there is a huge imbalance, I think also arguably helps build up health systems, builds up expertise in informal sector innovation and policy approaches, which can really embed the importance of those features of an economy in a national context. So the short answer is yes. The slightly more convoluted answer is, well, maybe not so much. I don't know. Yeah, I think there are relationships. But Erika.
Yes, that's I would also agree that the short answer is yes, and but I will also try and give a little bit of a longer explanation. So we've we've done quite a lot of research on looking at innovation in the informal economy, particularly in Africa, but also beyond. And one of the things that we found is that a lot of the innovations that are emerging from informal actors, not surprisingly, they don't rely on formal research and development, formal R&D, and sort of scientific knowledge in the same way as other productive activities do, right? So the type of knowledge that guides innovation in this sector is actually knowledge that emerges from a deep understanding of societal needs. It's sort of knowledge that emerges from society itself, and it can be called indigenous knowledge, but also other forms of knowledge emerging from society. But in a way, this also poses a limitation on the types of innovations that come out from the informal economy. And something else that we found is that when that connection between the informal economy and the broader innovation system, the formal sort of science institutions and education and training organizations, when those rare connections happen, actually the opportunities and the impact is enormous, and the possibilities are huge. So this really points us, because of the informal sector, in the informal sector, knowledge travels very quickly. Issues like copying and imitation and so on, there are dynamics that drive the day-to-day operations of informal actors. So once knowledge enters into the informal economy, it spreads very quickly, and it's got a huge potential for impact. So building those bridges between informal actors and formal science organizations are extremely difficult, but very important to pursue. And in a way, one can say that it's a way of making science systems perhaps more inclusive. And if those bridges are built properly, one can argue that the types of publications that we would see emerging from the science system will represent more accurately the social priorities, needs, types of knowledge that's sort of guided. So yes, in a way, I'm saying that currently not, or not much, or perhaps there's, as Joanna says, there's sort of differences in terms of disciplines and so on. So it's not a homogeneous statement, but I would argue that building those bridges is extremely important and necessary. Yeah, let me stop there.
Right. Thank you, Erika and Joanna. Let me move to another question that we have here. It says, in imagining new capitalisms, some panelists still accept the notion of continual growth and rely on innovation to solve challenges. Is growth a necessary condition to solve these challenges? And what are your thoughts on degrowth? So we could start with Rebecca and Henry, since we had Joanna and Erika in the previous one, and then Erika and Joanna, you can add points.
Henry, why don't you go first?
All right. Thank you. I thought, given Rebecca's recent book, this is your topic. Okay, I shall be brief. I mean, again, coming from East Asia, right? I mean, talking about continuing growth seems to be so taken for granted, and hence thinking of not growing or kind of a slow movement is really a very different kind of way of approaching. But I think given the grand challenges we're talking about here, environmental in particular, climate change, I think addressing some of these, one may argue, existential issues might well need slowing down the sort of a relentless drive for growth at all costs, and hence, we may not be able to, if you like, pay for the externalities that we generate today that are obviously not sustainable. So in that sense, I agree that there is no reason we should grow for the sake of growing. Again, Singapore is a bit unusual because we're a little city-state, so maybe we have to keep growing. But for a large territorial country, there is no reason you can't rely on the hinterland in terms of a certain kind of agricultural or industrial activities that, again, may not be so growth oriented, but certainly can reduce the kind of footprints and the environmental damages in terms of shifting some of those activities. So my sense is that degrowth or slowing down is an option. I mean, there is no reason it shouldn't be. Yeah.
So Henry, I'm going to disagree with you. I think we have to keep growing. I think for reasons of equity. You know, there are many, many people who still do not have access to steady power. You know, there are many people still who are still hungry. I think those of us in the developed world turning to people who still don't have electricity in their house and saying, no, we're stopping growth is just not feasible. I think the other reason growth is central is because, and here I'm drawing on a book called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth by Benjamin Friedman. And what he suggests is that societies that are growing are much more politically stable, that it is much easier to tolerate other people getting ahead, particularly people who don't look like you, if the society is growing and if you expect your children to have a better life than you do. And arguably one of the reasons we're seeing such nasty populist backlash in places like Poland and Hungary and the UK and the US is because that expectation of growth has hit the wall. So it's very politically destabilizing. What I think we need, is dematerialized growth. So economic growth with less stuff. And to a certain degree, the economy has been delivering that. Energy efficiency, for example, the amount of energy required to generate a unit of GDP has been steadily dropping. And indeed, I think it was the year before the pandemic, the UK became the first country whose GDP grew with using less stuff overall. So we could imagine shifting economic activity to service activities, doing everything with much more efficiently and effectively, using less, stuff, cement, concrete, steel, and still seeing economic growth. And to me, this is why innovation is so key, because we must keep growing if we're to retain political stability. And it's growth that generates the opportunity for innovation that drives change. So we need to grow, but it has to be dematerialized. And that's why we really need innovation.
Thank you, Rebecca. Would anybody else like to add? Joanna, Erika?
Can I come back very briefly to Rebecca's point about growth is sort of a necessary condition for stability and also overcoming inequality, poverty, and so I actually didn't mean so much of developing country not growing, but my actual example is, I think of Japan, actually. If you think of Japan, it has not been growing much for a long period of time. I mean, it's very slow. But people in Japan have taken it in their stride. I mean, they know there are structural conditions. They're not accepting migrants easily, and hence, of course, you have the aging population, which in turn leads to depopulation, and hence, and of course, plus, of course, the bubble burst in itself. So the point, and yes, they are politically, one may argue, stable and unstable, right? They have a lot of change in the government in terms of elections, but the overall political stability of Japan is considered as okay. So the moral of the story is, if I look at Japan, it kind of can hang on and get going. There is a difference between a 3% growth and relentless drive for 8 to 10% growth. I think that is, I think, what the question was about, rather than zero growth or negative growth. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to add their thoughts on this?
Quick comment from my side, perhaps. I think there is a lot that can be done by prioritizing redistribution. Especially if you look at, I mean, I'm speaking from the point of view of a country that is, one of the most unequal income inequality countries in the world, but I think that applies to many economies and that applies at the local level. So I think when we enter into this discussion of growth or degrowth, to me becomes secondary to thinking about how do we address the deeply entrenched imbalances that we face in terms of national economies, and this is even if we talk about developing countries. and even more if we look at the global scene. So I think a lot can be done if we prioritize redistribution in the first place, and then engage into whether we need further growing or not after we redistribute appropriately.
All right.
Yeah, I
Thank
think
you.
Sorry, I agree. I think with Erika that it's the nature of the growth that matters. Growth which exacerbates inequality, I think hasn't. I wonder about that, Rebecca. I'm so interested in what you said, but I wonder if we can still argue that it has a stabilizing effect, growth in and of itself. I live in a country which has voted recently to become poorer. And clearly we will have reduced growth as a result of that decision taken to leave the EU. And yet for, a significant portion of the population, they think that's the best choice. And that without that, we would have been in a less stable position. We'll see how it plays out. Who knows where the next few years will lead us. But I think growth which exacerbates inequalities and which is clearly in favor of an identified sort of global elite, is hugely problematic.
Right, and it's at the heart of the issue of unsustainable growth too, right? So what makes it more sustainable is definitely dealing with these issues of redistribution and addressing inequalities. Thank you. So I have another question for the panelists here, to all of you, back to connecting to the pandemic and vaccine production, but where do you see potential for transformative innovation that would make rapid upscaling of vaccine production in different parts of the world possible? This I think has been evident in this. You have the technology and the huge constraint has been, the ability to scale up production to get it to the world. So in addition to the issues of access, there isn't enough there. So that's the question there. Who would like to start? So we start in the middle. Joanna, would you like to start?
Well, maybe I could just say, I think the points Rebecca made about public-private partnerships and the importance of seeing this as not only as a state-led agenda, but addressing those capacities of production, those issues of production capacities as a joint public and private challenge is really important, because I don't think for the moment we're going to do it with only state-led initiatives.
Thank you, Joanna. Anybody else would like to say something on this?
I find the question rather difficult, primarily because you're asking for rapid upscaling of vaccine production in different parts of the world. And that you mean essentially much wider distribution of production capacity. And I'm just thinking of, say, in terms of Asia, currently only China. The ironic thing is Japan hasn't both innovated the vaccine and or produced. I mean, given biotech is so strong in Japan, I mean, it's really ironic. I mean, so I think, is it necessary for vaccine to be produced in every part of the world or in major continents, for example? That will probably solve the problem and concentrate the results. So say in Asia, you should probably have 3 or 4 countries that can upscale vaccine production beyond China, for example. So you're India, China, 1 in Southeast Asia, plus 1 more. That will be quite nice in terms of solving the crisis in at least in Asia as a whole. I mean, I have less expertise about other regions, but that's why I find the question very difficult, very tough, very tough.
If I may, I hear a point of view here from the Latin American perspective. I think this question is really good. I have wondered many times how Brazil, that has the capability to produce vaccines, I mean, that has developed it for many decades, how it is not able to come in, to produce the vaccines like India was done. We're in terms of the old technology. Let's not even talk about the mRNA technology, where so many countries, it's difficult, right? Given all of its requirements. But even the old technology for the COVAX program, we've been dependent on India, right? And Brazil in Latin America has the capabilities and has built there over a long time. And you wonder what has been stopping that entry of Brazil to produce, to increase the supply of vaccines for, even for Latin America, let's say. So this idea of having, distributed places around continents is good, but then how do we push, our thinking of innovation? And so I think that this brings us to the notions of which actors then do we see moving here to actually activate that production and making it a priority. Is it going to come from the firms? Is it going to come from the government? Is it going to, which actors are going to be doing this to organize this upscaling of vaccine production? And in the case of Brazil, I've been very surprised because they have excellent labs that they have built over the years. And you can say, well, here is a case where governments have not made it a priority to scale up. I don't think it's even an issue of having private firms allow them to produce it. So I think so I would just like to bring in here that while we talk about the role of firms, which of course matter here too, I think the fact that the governments do not make it a goal and a priority can certainly limit that possibility of upscaling that vaccine production, even when you have the capability. So I don't think that in this case is the lack of capability. It's just that you did not engage with it and did not make it a priority. So go back to regulations, or is it an issue also of ideological positions here on these issues that then limit? So I've had there my point. I'm looking at the time. So would anybody else like to add a comment on this?
Maybe just a brief from my side, which is not an answer, but rather a question. Whether in cases like this where the solution requires coordination in terms of engaging different policy actors and private sector and so on, where there's a need for global coordination, it inevitably raises the question of the need for global governance structures or global institutions to govern this. So in view of a future where we will find more and more of these instances shocking our world with different pandemics, this is quite likely. It begs the question of, do we need global governance structures to coordinate a response internationally in this particular area? It's a question, not an answer.
Thank you. Anybody else had an issue of this? I'm looking at the time here, and I have more questions, but I think I want to make sure that we have give a chance to our panelists to give their closing statements. But one as you close, maybe I can raise this. Many of you talked about bridging the issue of collaboration. You've just mentioned about the global collaboration. We've seen a lot of new forms of organizing innovation and that are tied to this idea of transformative innovation. That means that there are all kinds of new actors coming in. We heard from Henry, it's not enough to have the state. We hear it's important, the role, the firms and their role and how they reconceive their role and their purpose. We've talked about the science, research, and we've talked about the endogenous strategies and inclusion. But when we look at a lot of these new forms of organizing innovation, and particularly around health, let's say, and I'm doing this to keep this conversation connected to this major health crisis that we have, we see that going back to Joanna's point, even when we have global NGOs, bringing together multinationals, universities, people from different countries, that African countries, for example, remain excluded from engaging in a lot of these new organizations, consortia. Their role is pretty marginal. And we still see universities, let's say in Europe or North America, leading and being the main participants there in a lot of innovation around health, let's say around problems that are very relevant for Africa or for Latin America and some Asian economies. So as we give this closing statement and we think about innovation, how do you see the agency then? There is a lot of this talk about distributed agency. You mentioned all these different actors. So as you make your closing statements, then could you comment on this? And I will stop here to give each of our panelists 2 minutes for your closing thoughts. We can start in the reverse order. You presented, first it was Erika, then Henry and Joanna and Rebecca. So let's go Rebecca, Joanna, Henry, and then Erika.
Paola, you're asking a really tough question. I mean, I think first it's important to remember that we're sort of taking the vaccine for granted, but this vaccine was developed much faster than any previous vaccine. And so far as we can tell, is amazingly effective with minimal side effects. And that came out of, as you say, an ecosystem. Firms, I have friends in the industry and they talk about sharing ideas and working together and working at speed. Nearly everyone who could in any lab in Cambridge or Boston that I know about started working on this problem. So it was an incredible mobilization of talent. So we can see that these kinds of ecosystems can be incredibly successful. But, when you ask, and again, this is more Erika's expertise, why, say, scientists from Africa weren't so included, I would also say, well, scientists from Kansas or, Louisiana, that building this kind of intense scientific expertise around particular disciplines is, I think, as we know, very hard. I mean, the Chinese have by and large succeeded, but they spent an enormous amount of energy and time. Henry, I'm sure you must know more about this than I do. I mean, Singapore is an amazing success, but my goodness, it was really focused. Like, where are we going to double down on our scientific expertise? Very coherent policy making linked to a highly educated population. So it's not that it can't be done, but that it requires real focus, significant resources, and not trying to do it everywhere. It has to be, okay, this is going to be the hub for this kind of scientific expertise. Of course, there's absolutely no reason Africa shouldn't have world-leading universities, but it will take time and resources to build them. And forgive me, Erika, I'm sure you already have world-leading universities in some disciplines in South Africa, and I just don't know about it because they're not in biotech. But absolutely possible, but really takes focus.
Joanna?
Yeah, so I think it's been a fascinating discussion, and I feel like I'm rethinking things as I speak a bit, because powerful points have been made. But I do think that in the end we do have to focus on, I think capacity building is taking on board Rebecca's points. I do still think that capacity building and a redistribution of expertise and knowledge around the world is crucial if we're going to be transformative, if we're going to really get to addressing those social, economic, environmental goals at a global scale. I don't think we're going to get to it with the distribution we currently have. So I think the issue, as Rebecca, Erika, as you all, Henry as well, have indicated, is there's an alignment between national and global goals, which is difficult to reconcile in many ways, and there needs to be a new conversation around that. There needs to be a new conversation. It takes national leadership and global leadership to get that going. But that, I think, is what's needed if we're going to be truly transformative.
Thank you, Joanna. Henry.
Yeah, thank you. I will actually take the points further from both Rebecca and Joanna as well. I think Rebecca in terms of the critical importance of institutions, and Joanna talk about global governance, and I see it as political view. So to me, these two are really, really the ingredients that are very difficult to bring together, to engender, to nurture. But they are the real shortages. I think in terms of, getting scientists, knowledge workers together is probably less difficult than getting institutions right. And then, of course, having the political will, whether at national level and supranational level, to make it happen, to make it work. Because I think, personally, having seen through what's happened in the past 2 years, I mean, I've been reading a lot of news because we can't travel, isn't it? So I can't even get out of Singapore, So which can you imagine in your city just for 2 years, okay? So I thought, gosh, there is so much politics going on, which is really making things not happening or working in the way that they should. So I really think that political will is the most, sort of most important commodity in shortage. I think that's what I really see it. And I think since Rebecca earlier mentioned Singapore's determination to promote R&D, yeah, I think to a certain extent, political will is very important, and it kind of worked in our context. But yeah, it's going to be difficult in large democracies. I understand. Yeah, but that's where things should have to go. So thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Erika.
Thanks, Paola, and thanks all of you for your closing statements. I think I feel a lot of it has been already said, but perhaps Paola, just to comment on your provocation to us. I would perhaps speak about or mention the biases that exist in global science systems in general, where science that is recognized often relates to scientists that are operating in well-resourced labs that follow into certain sort of methodologies that may be recognized at this point in time globally, and that are connected often through funding to international networks. So in the case of South Africa, for instance, you have niches of expertise and excellence, islands of excellence, if you want, in this particular field, that many of them have been active and doing very, very important, relevant work that has contributed to the global efforts towards vaccine development. But I think the point is how to mobilize all talent. So it's not about mobilizing the few experts that are, for some reason, connected to global networks and have funding and so on, but how to mobilize all talent in these critical times where, as you mentioned, the mobilization of talent at all levels is a key answer to the solution. So I think, yes, I think it has to do with addressing these issues and thinking about the biases that exist in the global science systems and the position of scientists in developing countries in that space. But perhaps as a closing remark, I would like to just summarize in a little bit the point that I wanted to make is that for me, transformative innovation that address global challenges and the solutions there require not only looking at sort of the tech solutions, the broad tech solutions, the high tech solutions. And I did give the example of digital technologies as one of these avenues that is an entry point for a widespread transformation in the context of Africa. But I think also looking at where the majority of the people live, those communities where the majority of vulnerable and poor populations in developing countries are situated, and the solutions and the innovations that emerge from there. And seeing those as an asset and as an entry point to connect and create more inclusive science, technology, and innovation systems I think it's a very important entry point for the context of developing countries and Africa in particular. But thanks for the discussion. It's been fascinating.
Thank you, Erika. It's a wonderful point to conclude here. Particularly, I want to connect to SASE's goal and say that our president this year, Sigrid Kwak, really pushed the organizing committee to bring in diversity, bring in inclusion to our social science discussion, and to make this year's feature panels really characterized by diversity and inclusion. And we have certainly achieved that, and we can see how important it is, as we did here, to bring these different perspectives, different contexts for our goal to move the generation of knowledge, to move our thinking conceptually, and to mobilize different talents, as Erika has mentioned. And so I'm very happy with all of these generative ideas that have come together here. And we can see that this space of innovation and grand challenges has definitely a huge possibilities for us towards the future. So thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Erika. And thank you, Joanna. Thank you also to our technical support team. And thank you to our SASE participants for all your wonderful questions. Stay well, everybody, and see you next year. And let's continue the conversation. So thank you.